Okay, well, today we're here with Chris Weir, who is the CEO of the Verida Network. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Bill. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, just tell us about your current role and what a typical day involves for you. I appreciate you're in Australia and I'm in the UK, so we're on a bit of a time delay. But if you could just tell us what you do typically on a day.
Yeah, so as CEO of Arita, it's quite varied. It definitely changes from day to day, but a lot of what I typically do is working with our team. Obviously, we've got a team that's predominantly engineering focused, and I have an engineering background, so help collaborate with the team on our roadmap with our technology. Work with the team on some of our initiatives that we have with our partners and other stakeholders. Often working, coordinating with investors. We actually have a growing network of partners, so I'm increasingly spending time talking to partners about, how they're using our technology, the pain points they have, where we can maybe add more value. And also, talking on podcasts, and there's a bit of an education role about this emerging, I guess, Web3 space and security and data and things that we work on. So increasingly, yeah, have the privilege of being on podcasts like your own and share a little bit about what we're doing.
Great. So could you tell me a little bit about your past? What interests you as a child? What was your route through education?
Yeah, so I'm probably slightly abnormal in that respect. So growing up here in Australia, I was actually fortunate. One of our the local public school here, when I was sort of, I think, year six, seven, was one of the first to sort of get a computer. And so I think we had some Commodore 64s, and
Oh,
I was instantly struck by, what this new thing, this new toy was. I was always a very inquisitive child. So it wasn't long before I was sort of playing with, writing little basic scripts and making little sounds and things like that. And um, over the journey of, the last however many decades, probably a few too many, have really never been able to escape, I guess, technology and computers, and the way that I think they can be used to improve the world that we all live in. So as a teenager, I started to create games in C, or learn about different programming languages and Perl and shopping scripts and shopping carts and things like that. And um, I actually studied nanotechnology at university, and pure maths and finance, and I never actually finished anything because I was always sort of jumping from one thing to another, and sort of getting curious about all different things. But one thing I've never escaped from is building software, writing software, and building companies. And so um, more recently, about 10 years ago, I started a company called Community Data Solutions, which was all about data ownership and self sovereignty, and working with many disadvantaged people to help them have more trust around their data. And I sort of took my technology experience and sort of applied this to this new area. And from there, a few hops and skips and jumps, and now I'm sort of at Verida, where I'm really fortunate to be able to push forward with what I think is really interesting space and a really interesting technology and opportunity for improving the way that we all handle our digital lives online.
it's great. Yeah, I'm sure many people will be so happy to hear that you started on the Commodore 64. I think I read yesterday that Larry Page, the co-creator of Google, before he went to Stanford, actually his first engagement with computers was with a Commodore 64. So obviously spark that desire to your creativity in creating code and creating digital spaces.
Yeah,
So
I remember. I think I had one of those Commodore 64s where you couldn't save anything, so always had to leave it on 24/7. Otherwise, you'd lose the code that you'd written. So, fortunately, we've come a fair way since then.
yeah, I forget the microprocessor that was involved. I know there was the 8088, which was used in the PC, the Z80, and so on, and there was the Motorola chip. But that whole time just sparks so much innovation And obviously, Steve Jobs was using the 6502 chip, I think, at the time, MOS Technologies, to build his Apple One, and then advanced onto the Motorola chip and so on. So it's great to see that period sort of sparks
Yeah,
something
it was a
in you.
very fruitful period in learning. I mean, yeah, if I just quickly recap there, it was, I think, yeah, Commodore 64. I think we had an Amstrad PC of
Ah,
some sort
oh,
at home. And then we had, and then yeah, getting into DOS and Windows 3.1 and the Windows variants, and then quickly found Linux. And then, from there, you delve into everything. Suddenly you're doing bash scripts and reinstalling, to get drivers working. So you very quickly, if you very quickly learn about how a computer works and what are the different pieces when you start to play with things like Linux. And that was definitely a really formative period for me, I guess, in those teenage years, just sort of absorbing as much as I can. And the internet really came in about when I was 15 or 16. So it was really interesting. I
yeah.
was sort of at the crux of reading books and learning about this stuff. I read, I think, everything in the local library, and then suddenly the internet was there, and it was just this new and really exciting world. And I've never really been able to escape it. I'm still really excited by how, what we can do. And there's always new things now. It's, it's Web3, it's AI. There's so much always on the horizon.
I agree. And I remember the internet growing and networking and TCP/IP, Ethernet, and so on. And you watched it, but you couldn't really be part of it. I think the great thing now with Web3 and the cryptography and blockchain is that you now have the opportunity to be part of that change and to move things forwards. So my first main question is what you got you into digital IDs?
Yeah, so it was, to be honest, it's a little bit by accident. I think, uh, if I recap before, I sort of had this company. We were building software for non-profit organizations, and what we were really doing is we had a CRM system that we would deploy to an organization that would allow them to manage the data about their clients. So this might be somebody with, maybe they've got dealing with domestic violence, or they've got gambling addiction, or a lot of the most vulnerable people, I guess, in the community were seeking support. And what happened effectively was we were selling the software. It was quite successful, but I would go and train people, and I would talk to them about why are they using the software? What other problems do they have? Just very open-ended questions. And I quickly learned that while our software was great, it was creating a problem in the space, because what would happen is if I was, maybe I was coming in to get support as a client, I'd have to go and sit down with someone, a caseworker, and I'd tell my story, and it might take 1 or 2 hours, and the caseworker would enter that into the computer. And um, what happened then is the person would say, the caseworker would say, hey, Chris, look, thank you for sharing all of that. Now go and talk to these 5 other people and get support in these different areas. And then you'll have to repeat your story to all 5 of those people so that they can put your story into their computer systems. And it sort of suddenly hit me that we've evolved to these SaaS kind of business models from technology, which is all about these cloud systems, and they're all about us giving our information, our data, and hence our identity really into these different systems. And we've lost ownership and control of that. Even when I was a little kid, I still remember, we moved house, and my mum could go to the doctor and get a manila folder of all our health records and then take them to the new town. And we had that agency and ownership, but we've kind of lost that now. And around this time, Cambridge Analytica hack happened with Facebook, where there was a lot of people with their data that was sort of taken, and it made me really think about what is data, what is identity, how do we interact with that. And I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but for me, it was really important to kind of tackle this problem of, we've lost control of our data. How do we own it? Our data is really who our identity is. If we go to Facebook, the data that we put into Facebook is our identity. It's not really our username. You go to LinkedIn, it's all of your connections. It's all these other pieces of data that make up who you are as an identity. And we're really in this world where centralized platforms control that digital identity. And I kind of fell into it because I wanted to solve this problem of owning your own data. And I realized, well, you actually have to own your own identity first. And so those two are very intrinsically linked. And so through that journey, kind of came into the Web3 space as well, where we have the concept of public and private keys, and there's sort of a quasi identity system kind of forming in this Web3 space.
Okay. So, what problem do you think that self-solving identity solves, and what is it that your network is trying to build?
Yeah, so um, there's a couple of things here. So at the moment, we have identities that are in different forms. So you could think of an email address is an identifier. It's a form of identity in the digital sphere. We have our personal identity as a real physical person, and that can be represented as a passport, or as a driver's license. There's different credentials or digital forms potentially, or physical forms that our identity, our real world identity, can be represented. And at the moment, the world we live in with centralized platforms like Google and Facebook and Apple, those companies control those addresses. They control those identities, those accounts. They can control whether you have access to your information that's contained within them. They can delete you. They can get hacked and leak all of your information. We are very much at the mercy of what are the centralized platforms and the identities that they control on our behalf. And so one of the really exciting things about decentralized and self-sovereign identity is that there's no counterparty, there's no centralized party there. As an individual, I can just create one, I can create many of these identities, and I am the complete owner and controller of that identity on some public infrastructure. And that has a whole range of really interesting benefits around, obviously you're in control, nobody can kind of come in and take ownership or control over your identity. There's a standard there, so there's interoperability. There's a way of different identities kind of connecting to each other and communicating. And where we sit, where Verida fits, is the Verida network is solving one piece of this puzzle. It's saying, hey, if I've got a new decentralized identity in this future world, I also want to have my own private information. I want my own private data that my identity can unlock, or that others can request access to, and I can grant permission to, or perhaps I can sign some data and share that with others, and it can be trusted that it's been signed by me. And so really that's the piece of this sort of future self-sovereign world that we're tackling with the Verida network. It's this globally public infrastructure where if I've got a private key, I can effectively create a collection of databases that are mine, and I can consent to different applications, give them permission to connect to my data and use my data in those applications. But the owners of those applications can't see my data. They can't do anything with it. It's just sort of temporarily made available and then removed again when I remove it. So it's really about this, decentralized identities enabling this interoperability and this new future world that can extend to data, but it can also extend to messaging and to, computation. There's a whole range of areas that this new concept can extend in terms of what that technology infrastructure looks like.
It's great. Yeah, I do understand that completely about some um, web service providers having so much control. I lost my LinkedIn account twice because I posted something that was too popular, and it triggered that I was a bot. And then I was kicked off. And for, I think, around a week or so, I didn't have any LinkedIn presence, and people thought I disappeared from the internet. And that control of these large companies is so important. Twitter could easily not like what you said. If you didn't say something about Twitter, they could, well, it's not Twitter anymore. It's
It's now
X,
X.
or
Yeah,
whatever it's called this week.
you're exactly right. We're at the mercy of them, but there's also other subtle ways there. So, for instance, um, I personally wanted to play with my data on LinkedIn. I get a lot of messages on LinkedIn, and I wanted to explore if there was a way I could create another interface to make that a bit more easy to use and to filter that. But I can't. The LinkedIn API does not allow me to actually access my own private messages. And I think that that's completely crazy. Like, not only do they have that control, but they can also control what of my own data I can actually unlock. And that's incredibly debilitating when you think of innovation. If you've got other companies or organizations that could actually help you better manage your different systems, that could actually be creating some really great, useful productivity tools. But you can't do that because we can't access our own data in some instances. So, there's certainly a lot of improvements I think we can make to the status quo.
Okay, so there's digital trust, the cryptography and the blockchain, the digital signing, and so on. And there's human trust. And really, the two don't bridge that well together. How do you think, and I'm not expecting you to answer this because no one really has an answer. How can you make sure that that human trust is there and that they understand that in the back end there's digital trust? Because I could show a nice little green bar to show that everything is secure, and the user might think that is security, just that little green sign, but really cryptographically there might be smoke and mirrors. How do you think you can get humans to understand that these systems are trustworthy as opposed to the systems that we have now?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And there's so many different parts to that question as well. Um, the first thing comment I'd like to make is that Web3 and crypto generally has a bit of a love-hate relationship with trust. They talk about being trustless because of the way the computation works. However, you then typically have to trust a smart contract developer to be doing the right thing. Or there's often, I think Curve was hacked a day or two ago for 30 million. There's been hacks of $600 million in the past. So there's a breach of trust somewhere there where people then have less trust and confidence in this blockchain technology, even though the problem might be over here, and the rest of the system is actually trustworthy. So there's a lot of nuance in, I guess, the word trust and what it means to different people and contexts. In relation to bringing real world human trust, I guess, and connecting that to this digital space, I like to think of analogies, and probably the best analogy that exists today in a way is that the web browser, with the green little box that says, hey, this is a verified SSL certificate. And underpinning that, there's a huge number of layers of trust that's happening. You have the web browser you're trusting is is not infected with some sort of malware, or hasn't been breached in terms of how it's been built. You've got the SSL certificate that has to make sure it's been signed by a private key that's been trusted, that is a certificate authority. Within each of those different elements, you've then got potential of injection attacks in source code, of dependencies and things like that could inject problems. So there's a whole technological trust. And then from a user, we're kind of dumb, and we just have to, at the end of the day, trust some sort of like green button or tick. And we think about this a lot because we've got a mobile crypto wallet, and we're trying to enhance the trust because people get phishing attacks and things like that. So I don't have a great answer other than to really say that whatever that interface is between the technology and human, it has to be incredibly simple and easy to understand. And it has to be built on a root of trust that already exists. So for instance, I trust Google to a certain degree, and I will therefore trust the Google Chrome browser, and therefore I will trust that green tick that is in the Google Web, Chrome browser. And so the root of trust for me is Google. Similarly, some people use Brave browser, some people use Internet Explorer or whatever. So there's a root of trust that we all have, and that actually will underpin what the interface is, I think, that we then therefore trust.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense to me. I think maybe the way that we developed the internet through requests for comments, we don't really think about security and trust. We just needed to get this thing built, and we created the OSI 7-layer model, which doesn't mention security anywhere. And then we had to fix it, and then we shoehorned in an SSL TLS layer to make sure, but that was still machine to machine, and we forgot about all the other things that happened. I saw a good model published with a 7-layer equivalent for the 21st century, and the lowest layer was cryptography or maths, but the layer above was software engineering. And if you don't get the software engineering right, then you don't have a solid foundation. And then above that, you had things like rights and governance, and so on, all the things that we see in our society. So it's almost like we've built the internet from a technical point of view. We've built on Ethernet, we've built on packet switching and IP addresses, TCP, and so on. And they are very much a technical solution and not really fit for mapping to our societies. So I suppose my next question is that in some countries, and I'll say the UK is one of them, especially the larger countries, there is a resistance against digital identity. And it happened in the UK that the UK government wanted to roll out an identity scheme in the early 2000s, and one blog post from an anonymous person killed it dead, because that blog post said that the government just wants to spy on you. Don't trust this thing. Other countries in the world, Estonia, and certainly the Scandinavian countries, there is much more trustworthy in the governments and so on. So, and I know that you're based in Australia. I wouldn't want you to comment on anything from Australia, but I think Australia and the UK are kind of in the same area space of this tension. So, how do you think that governments can improve their viewpoint to allow citizens to adopt digital identity in whatever form you think would be best for the access to public services and things like elections and so on? It's a big question, and I'm not
Yeah, no,
again
it
expecting
is
you
a
to
big
answer it.
question, but it's a really important question. It's in some ways it's the core of what a lot of the Web3 movement is. It's around how can technology innovation help society move forward in a positive way. So in Australia, for my whole life, really, we've had a constant debate about some form of identity. So we've called it the Australia card. It's never happened because similarly, there's been a lot of fear in the community that such a thing would, be used to spy on people and track them and things like that. There's an irony in that, in a way. I mean, I tend to agree with that. I think that it's important that we have anonymity and privacy by default. Unfortunately, we actually live in a world, I think, today where we are tracked already by governments and corporations to an incredible extent. The tax office here in Australia knows if I've bought or sold crypto because they can, talk to the banks, and they now talk to the crypto exchanges. So whether we like it or not, at least, where I am, this is tracking and stuff's already happening, which is, I guess, important to note. I actually think that there's a huge efficiency dividend in an economy by having identities that can interoperate and that can be used as identifiers in a positive way. Being able to file your taxes and do that in a way where you can easily establish who you are and have a history with a tax department is helpful. Being able to receive a message or funds from the government, in a particular circumstance is really helpful too. But the problem is obviously doing that in a way that is privacy preserving and protecting the individual's right to anonymity. And that's fundamentally where self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity can play a really important part, because as an example, one of the projects that we have with Polygon ID allows me as an individual to create one or many of these identities, and it's effectively free. And I can then have somebody attest and say, hey, this is definitely Chris, and that could be the government. It could be a third party that I've shared my passport with. And then once I've got this digital credential, I could go and use that with any other business, any other government, any other third party, and I could prove exactly who I are in a trusted manner. And I could, but in the first point, I'm not sharing any identifiable information if I don't want to. I could prove I'm over 21, or I could prove I'm born in Australia, or I could choose to provide all of my information if I so wish. So there's an opportunity here to use this technology, I think, to get the benefits of digital identity, the efficiency gains that you can have in an economy, but do it in a privacy preserving way, do it in a way where the user still is in control. I think we're still a little bit early in terms of decision makers, policy makers, regulators understanding what that capability looks like and how that can be applied, and how that can perhaps overcome some of these trust concerns and communicate that effectively to a broader community. But I'd like to think that at some point we'll have have the ability for that conversation to be had. And I feel like Web3 and crypto is sort of forging the way with awareness of what this technology is, what it does. And this sort of big change takes time, and it probably more like, we're probably talking more decades and generational change in terms of understanding of technology, rather than saying it's something that's happening, in a very short time frame.
And it's almost like cybersecurity has grown up. When I think about it, we started with public IP addresses. In a university, we have public IP addresses where every single computer was connected to the internet. We were so rich with all these IP addresses. And then how do we stop people connecting? We had firewalls, and we created blacklists, which is a crazy concept. Really, we allow everything, but we stop all these other things. And then we went towards whitelists. And now the core concept is that just don't trust anything. Just nobody is trusted. Nobody has access to anything you need to prove, and you'll get enough to do what it is you do. So you talk about your generalized layer zero identity and data infrastructure. Could you just explain what that is as a concept? Where does the zero part come into this?
Yeah, so I guess at the very core, I mean, there's in the Web3 crypto world, you kind of think of like an L1 blockchain, which is sort of like a primary blockchain, and then you can have L2 blockchains that kind of are roll-ups that can kind of roll up information to the L1 chain. L0 is typically referred to as something that's a bit more generic again, that could host maybe multiple blockchains. And so in a similar way, we see that what we're doing with data is layer zero, in the sense that it's fundamental database encrypted private storage controlled by a user, but it can connect to multiple blockchains. It can connect to multiple apps. So it's a very fundamental piece of infrastructure that we believe can be controlled by the user and connect to many different platforms, protocols, etc. Where you're seeing at the moment others innovate in this space, there's things like IPFS, which is the Interplanetary File System. So that's a decentralized file system that is public by nature. Very, very wonderful information. But it's actually, the white paper was actually based on torrenting technology. And so it's fundamentally a solution really well suited to files, videos, images, documents, distributing them in a really efficient way. Whereas what we're looking to solve is a problem on the individual level. Could I have a decentralized version of like a MongoDB or an SQL database that's mine, that I control and my private key unlocks, and then I can grant access to some parts of that information to different apps or my doctor, or maybe I can prove a little bit about my information on this blockchain and then that blockchain. So really thinking about this as the hub of all of my information, and I'm then just sort of cherry picking and connecting to different protocols and platforms.
Yeah, that makes sense. So obviously our identity is typically owned not by us, but by Meta and Microsoft and so on. And now you see Meta controlling so many platforms, WhatsApp and Instagram and so on, and they're looking to merge all of these identities. And obviously there is reasons that they want to merge these identities. And when WhatsApp was sold to Facebook, actually one of the last things that the developers did was to put the end-to-end encryption in there, and they've kept it in there. But what advice would you give to application developers about integrating digital identities so that we don't end up with this lock-in process? Federated identity was a big thing for a while. I can log in through Google or Live and so on, and it's kind of flawed. So if I was an application developer, how would I best integrate self-solving and identity, but maybe still use other identities around the system? Because we do have our Gmail accounts and we have our university business accounts and so on. We have different identities, and it's a bit of a mess. But generally, we're focusing on maybe one or two core identities that is the reset for our bank or is the reset for our work. So those are fundamentally important for us. And really, if they were to be abused in any way, we would end up being in trouble. So what would you say to an application developer about how to best integrate this new type of identity?
Yeah, so this is something that we think about a lot because we do work with a range of different projects across, I guess, what we call Web 2 and Web 3. Um, there's there's a little bit of a split brain situation, to be honest, in terms of where we live in the world today. You know, if you use most software these days, it's sort of that like you say, the federated sort of sign in. It's like sign in with Google, sign in with, Apple, sign in with whoever, and as a last resort, sign in maybe with your own email and password. Um, and then in the crypto world, it's sign in with Ethereum or connect your crypto wallet, and that's how you kind of connect. And what we're seeing from the front line, I guess, is that people that are coming to a Web3 app from Web 2 just drop off. I think it's about 40 to 50% of people just drop off as soon as it says connect wallet because it's just too big and scary. And, and there's a trust piece there, right? They don't know what this new thing is, so they're not going to trust it, which is actually completely rational, human behavior. And so there's a lot of projects and a lot of people thinking about, okay, how do we have the Web 3 and the Web 2 kind of, sign in working together because you need to grow this new world by kind of bringing people over with what they're familiar with and then maybe upgrade them to the more decentralized or the more self-sovereign sort of solution. So ideally, I'd like to be able to say to you, Bill, that hey, it's great. Just do the connect button and connect a crypto wallet, and you've got a self-sovereign decentralized entity. But that's not the reality. You're actually going to hamper adoption in the long term. I think if we just stick with the new world. And so my suggestion and some of the tooling that we're working with a few projects on is how do you have a bit of both? If people have got a crypto wallet, great, start with that. If they don't, it's okay. Like here's the Web 2 friendly option, and then it becomes an education piece of hey, you could upgrade this to become something that you completely own and control. And I've skipped over some technical nuance in terms of how you sign in with a Web 2 platform and then upgrade that to be like a crypto wallet. But that's a space that's kind of emerging at the moment because there's an understanding that this is a pain point for developers and it's a challenge for apps that want to build the right way, but also have a strong user traction.
Yeah, and I suppose it's linking this thing to that thing. And I think we're becoming comfortable that we can now replace our wallets with this. And I think the trustworthiness around our smartphones and then the concept of the wallet within there is the anchor point. And I think this will be shown as a time of great innovation. And I think it's taken the cryptocurrency. I mean, like it or not, they started it and they've been involved in the research. They kicked the tires and they did some bad things and they did a lot of good things. But now we're seeing the methods that were applied in cryptocurrency into citizen identity and how you live your lives. And for the user, it's a wallet that stores their birth certificate. What an amazing concept to not have to send away and get a bit of paper for your birth certificate when a child is born. That instance, they have a digital footprint that they could own, and it can be part of building up a digital space. But unfortunately, governments, public sector have got decades of catch up. So just now, there's probably going to be before ChatGPT and after ChatGPT. That it's the world is evolving through AI, machine learning. Perhaps it's false machine learning. Perhaps it's not the great wave that we would expect that machine learning has taken over many of the decisions that humans would take. But it's certainly a key break point in our society. How do you think what do you think the upside of AI and machine learning will be for citizen identity? And I know what you're going to say for the downside. What generally is the downside of AI and machine learning? What impact will it have on our lives? I'll give you an example. ChatGPT has crawled my data and it says I invented the hypervisor, which if I did, I probably wouldn't be talking to you just now. I would have licensed it to Amazon and so on. So there's a limit to what it says, and it's basing itself on probabilities and so on, and that's not really intelligence. So in the digital space and privacy and so on, how will AI and machine learning affect this space?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. One of the key downsides is accuracy when it's trained to be, I guess, generalist. And for public figures, that can be quite a problem if you're misrepresented. On the positive side, I think we have a huge opportunity, really. I think in front of us, and with AI, if it's used and harnessed appropriately. As with all new technology, there's good elements and bad elements, and more broadly, there's often misunderstandings from the public that don't understand how it works or the nuance with new technology, which is always a challenge. And there's a great risk here that AI sort of GPT shoots itself in the foot because it's quickly mistrusted because of some of the inaccuracies. And then coming back to our conversation at the beginning around trust, then this whole space has a trust issue and people don't feel comfortable, trusting new AI products and services. So there's definitely a risk there. In terms of how this relates in a positive way and to, I guess, identity is there's, I think, a greater understanding or awareness perhaps of what an identity looks like. If we have AI bots that are creating fake accounts and are creating fake content, there's probably more of a need to have a digital identity that is an infrastructure that's robust and allows us to distinguish with consent, between somebody that's real and somebody that's a bot or AI. And things like digital signatures are really valuable to prove who generated content, and blockchain is important to prove when that content was created and do that in a publicly trusted, transparent way. So I think there's a lot of identity, cryptography, that all of those tooling is going to be a really powerful ally of bringing more trust into the digital world to differentiate between what is and isn't AI. One of the opportunities that really excites me, and it links a little bit to what we're doing with Verida, is in the future, I should be able to pull all of my information from both Web 2 and Web 3 platforms, and whether it's the Verida network or something else, be able to take complete ownership of my data. And in a future world where we have so much, basically our whole lives are digital in some form, really, these days, with photos and videos and location, the ability to in a privacy preserving way, train an AI model over all of my information and then be able to be an agent on my behalf, or to help me, advance my career by making suggestions of events maybe I should attend, or people I should talk to, or courses I could do, or help me, in advance of my health. I think there's a really amazing opportunity for AI to be used to benefit us directly as individuals. And I think there's still a bunch of steps to get to that. But that's something that really excites me. I think that if this technology, I think it's quite powerful, and we can see that already. It's not perfect and it will get better. But if we can harness that for ourselves rather than, I guess, for more profit and whatnot, or exploitation in some regards from centralized platforms by just adding this as a sort of a value add, I think we lose the point. I think there's a really significant opportunity here to use this for the greater good for us as individuals.
Great. Well, for over a decade, we've been involved in healthcare research, applying cryptography, cybersecurity, information sharing, and probably it's the number one barrier in healthcare, especially in the UK, is the lack of sharing between primary and secondary healthcare, social care. I don't know what you call it in Australia, but we have primary care, your GP, secondary care, your hospital, and then you have tertiary care or social care. And really, the domains don't talk, and even within the domains, they struggle to share information at all. And I have no electronic healthcare record that I can really access, and so on. And it's almost like a catch up. Years of underfunding of technology in healthcare, especially in the NHS. We've had projects such as Connecting for Health, which I think spent over £15 billion and ended up with zero. It was meant to build an amazing infrastructure of healthcare, digitization, and so on. So I know for a fact it's a very resistant sector. The professionals and the clinicians and the nurses tend not to trust technology and see it as a barrier to the work. And I know that you've worked in one of the application areas is in healthcare. What was the problem you were solving and how did you manage to solve it?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that question. So I think healthcare, you're right. So healthcare is very challenging. There's a lot of embedded monopolies. There's a lot of powerful, organizations that that have a lot of say, over what happens and what data can be shared, and then you have governments that, often they've got a great objective, trying to make data more interoperable and portable and shareable, but still have a lot of other constraints that they have to work with, and the technology has sort of been evolving. So I guess some of the things that we did was early proof of concepts in COVID. So when COVID came about, there was a lot of talk around COVID certificates and things, of that nature. While we didn't have anything going into production, we did have a lot of conversations with projects that were looking to solve that problem. And there's a huge opportunity there to do it right. COVID was an interesting opportunity, but everyone was trying to move really fast. So the vast majority of governments and organizations that were involved in those processes were doing whatever they were familiar with and comfortable with. And so a lot of this technology is still seen a little bit too early. And I think there's an education time piece again, particularly with something as important as healthcare, which means it's a little bit early with some of this stuff. The way I really think about it, I do get frustrated when you see numbers of $15 billion on a project that, one of the very first proof of concepts that I actually did with the Verida network was a mock-up of a patient-doctor scenario where effectively a doctor signed in with MetaMask using a crypto wallet, and that unlocked a whole bunch of like a little EMR system, could create a patient. The patient you could then put the identifier, the DID that the patient had, and then send the data to the patient. The patient could get that data, then they could consent to sharing it with a new doctor. So really showing that ability to kind of share data with an individual and then allow that individual to share some or all of that data back. And so over the last sort of 2 years, I guess the way we think about this has kind of changed. And we see a fundamental shift that we're aiming for here, where we're moving away from this many-to-many architecture where all of these, governments and business and organizations all talk to each other about me. Whereas the better approach is actually all of them just talk to one person, which is actually me. So everyone just sends my data back to me, and then I can consent and share that back to other parties. And you look at what that would actually cost, it's actually not that expensive, because basically everyone just does one integration and it's to the same interface, the same API, which is to me and a digitally native sort of API representation of myself. That's very scary though for a lot of these organizations, because they then lose a lot of control over data. They lose control over making backroom deals around who has access to that data or earning revenue from that. And there's actually a realistic example here in Australia where we did introduce a health initiative where you go to your doctor and then you would basically consent to your data being shared back to a government system, and then your data would then be able to be accessed by hospitals and have that sort of centralized health record that could be accessible by any healthcare provider that was on the system. very quickly before it even launched. It got a lot of bad publicity because there was talk that the data was already being leveraged by marketing companies and insurance companies, health insurance companies, and so immediately back again, we keep circling back to trust. Trust in that system broke down very, very quickly. And so a vast number of people just opted out from the very beginning of that system, which as soon as everybody sort of opts out, it becomes kind of useless because if everyone's not on it, it's actually not very useful. So again, this is where decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity, this technology could actually give the same outcome, but do it in a way that it actually works for all parties.
That's great. And now, of over the past few decades, we've had crypto wars, and it's kind of settled down in that we're moving towards end-to-end encryption and much better trust in the applications and the services that we're using. But obviously, the tension is between the rights of privacy for the citizen against the rights of society to protect itself. It goes back to the Clipper chip, where at one time you used to have to register your encryption key with the US government so that it could crack your communications, and with Marty Hellman and so on, and with Tahir El Gamal through SSL, having an export embargo because it was seen as munitions level code, and obviously they crippled the cryptography at the time, and we've faced lots of vulnerabilities because of that crippling. So I'm not expecting you to answer this. And the UK currently has the online safety bill, and we're debating it like anything here. The industry is saying that they're just going to pull out of the UK totally if there is going to be a backdoor in the applications and so on. They just want support, which would take the UK back almost like centuries, and be in a league with some countries in the world that they might not want to. And I know that Australia has a lot of tensions in this space. So I'm not expecting you to have any answers here, and I'm not expecting you to say anything about the countries of the world or anything like that. But how do you think, because there are obviously bad applications of this end-to-end encryption, can support terrorists and people to do bad things, like the Tor network was never intended to be a bad network, but it just happens to be used by criminals and so on. And cryptocurrency is used by cyber criminals. So, from a personal point of view, how can we address this auditability for law enforcement agencies and for money laundering and all those bad things against that balance of the rights of the citizen to privacy? It's a big question. We could
Yeah,
spend a
it's a
whole
big
podcast
question.
on that.
Yeah, it's a big question, but it's also a really important one. And um, you're right. It's this sort of conflict and balance between protecting society and protecting the individual fundamentally. I don't think we'll ever escape this, to be honest. And so I guess I like to think of it like this. So, I'm sitting here talking to you, and I've got an Apple MacBook. Um, if I was using this MacBook to be a terrorist or to do something malicious, um, the MacBook is enabling me to do that. It's facilitating me. Is the problem the MacBook, or is the problem me? And so I think it's really important to distinguish between the actor, the individual, and the technology. And I don't think we should ever really hamper or restrict innovation with technology for the sake of the fact that there could be bad actors that could use that. Because as we sort of already touched on a few times, technology can be used for good and for bad. It's just another tool. You can use a hammer for good, you can use a hammer for bad. So I think that in some ways, you could argue that attempts to hamper cryptography or to use technology as a way to protect society is actually cheating. It's trying to cheat a little bit. It's trying to use a shortcut to traditional methods of investigating and to finding, problems or people, and identifying, something that's happening in society that shouldn't be happening. And I probably don't believe, I guess, that we should hamper innovation and, moving forward as a society as a whole, because of a few bad actors that potentially could use something in a nefarious way. Now, that's generalization. There's obviously, I think there's specific examples where uh, every means possible, perhaps, is important. But yeah, it's a challenging one for people that have the power to try and put back doors in and to try to feel like they're protecting society. It's a very attractive carrot to do that, but I think, as you say, if you did that in the UK, you'd move back, a couple of 100 years in terms of where you sit in the world, and that's going backwards. And we want to be going forwards, I think, as a society. So I think that's the balance. If we want to go forwards as a society, we have to keep, using technology and understand that it can be good and bad, and find other means to protect ourselves as a society from those bad actors.
Yeah, thank you. I saw a research paper over the weekend, and it was focused on privacy preserving cryptocurrencies such as Zcash and Monero, and obviously they pride themselves in the way it's not possible to be able to trace the identities of the payer and the payee and the transaction amount. They use zero knowledge proofs and range proofs for that. And this new paper was introducing the concept of an access key. It's almost like you still keep the privacy, but you can have some access key which is using attribute-based encryption. So you can share the key. You can do a Shamir share. So if it's the CIA and the FBI, then they've got to bring their keys together and so on. They've got to be based in a certain place in the world and so on. But I thought it was quite interesting that it defined the concepts of jurisdictions. So you look after the UK, and basically the transactions that are out with the UK are none of your worry. And I just thought it was a first example of a kind of crypto binding that I've seen that actually said we do need auditability, and if we're going to create central bank digital currencies, for example, there needs to be some way to at least have an analysis. If someone has $1 trillion transaction, at least we know about it. But if it's a $10, then it doesn't matter. So I think that's work in progress, how we can anonymize, go for the zero identity layer, but then maybe build on top of that and have the hooks into the cryptography so that the lowest layer is still till zero. So one of the areas that is advancing, and I think the EU is probably the most advanced, and it's the biggest economic area to be advancing in digital identity. So they're promoting EBSI, which is their identity ledger based on Hyperledger. So it isn't a public blockchain, and EIDAS2 for the digital signatures to make sure that they are legally binding. And they obviously want to harmonize trade and look at freedom of movement. And the EU really want to break down physical borders between countries and different systems. If I want to move from Greece to Poland, get a job there, they want to harmonize it. So they have a grand plan of using digital identity as a hook and to be able to create a digital wallet and so on, and really break down a lot of the barriers that were built up over the centuries. Is this achievable? They're talking about even next year as standardizing or making this mandatory. Do you think that can work at that kind of scale?
So I'm based in Australia, but I've actually just returned from a month in Europe. And one of the key things that I was doing in Europe was, I guess, getting a first-hand, conversations with people that are involved with that process. I'm definitely not going to sit here and say I'm an expert, but um, the conversations that I had sort of indicated that it's probably two years away, but they've been saying that for 2 years. So every 2 years, it's still 2 years away. So um, the timing is very uncertain. I mean, if it does happen, it is certainly something that will rapidly bring forward, I guess, that timeline we talked about earlier in terms of adoption of decentralized digital identity. Whether it's decentralized is still a little bit to be determined. There's a lot of, I think, technical detail that is still being worked out, and I think the decentralization is a little bit of a step too far. It will be probably a digital identity, but centralized, which um, is, if that's what happens, it'll be a little bit disappointing, but maybe it'll be the first step, perhaps. I think the advantages of digital signatures and a lot of the other elements there are going to be very, very beneficial. Digital decentralized identity and I guess non-private sector identity, if I want to call it that, has really struggled with adoption because it's a many to many problem, because you have if you have credentials, you have a holder, somebody who has a credential, you have somebody who issues you a credential, whether that's a government or a business, and then you have a verifier that wants to verify it. And so those three parties all need to have consensus, and they all, if I'm holding a credential, it needs to be accepted by lots of verifiers, and they need to have lots of issuers to issue it. So it's very hard to get two-sided marketplaces to work, let alone three-sided marketplaces to work. So I think that, to be honest, the biggest chance of success that we have is regulation. That defines and says, okay, we're doing this. Everyone has to come on board, and overnight we'll have 400 million, digital identities or whatever the number is in Europe. And that will be, I think, an incredible achievement. If it's not going to be perfect, there's going to be things that people like myself that are very big on decentralization, self-sovereignty, are going to be disappointed about. But if this is the first step of the digital wallet that is, interoperable and bringing a lot of these benefits, I think there'll be an evolution of that from there, which will bring more decentralization, more self-sovereignty, more control from users. So from our perspective, we can leverage such a system. If there's 400 digital identity wallets, well, we can connect that into what we're doing with Verida and start to help those same people unlock now their own data and connect to Web3 and crypto. So I think it'll be the start of a really exciting journey if that happens, but the form and makeup and the timing is still pretty unclear at this point.
It's great, yeah. And the business model of the internet has been built around providing free services. So Google, Facebook, Meta, Twitter have been providing free services, and then they can harvest our data. That, for the citizen, they're willing to cope with that. But you see now with Twitter or X or whatever it's called, that's becoming flipped, and now you're seeing charges for verified identities and things like that. And it's almost like monopolizing advertising revenue. Google gets most of it because they're the ones that are harvesting, but they still kind of keep the citizen on side. But there are hundreds of advertising affiliate agencies that are just hooking off your data. So how do you think that will flip? We've talked about getting money back for our data, but it's never quite happened in the past. How's the democratization of data going to change, do you think, the internet?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Again, we as consumers don't like to pay for things, and the the evolution of the internet up to this point has been very driven by accessing free services. Web3 and crypto, on the other hand, by its very nature and design, there's nothing free. In fact, it's a huge problem for adoption, is that you can't do anything unless you actually get some crypto. And to do that, you have to get a wallet, and you have to then put a credit card in, you have to get some crypto, and then your bank might reject the transaction, and then you have to convert the crypto to the right token. And there's a whole story there that makes adoption of Web3 and crypto quite challenging for many new people, which is a huge barrier today. You're seeing, I think you're right, with Twitter, now X, this growing trend of consumer products starting to charge the user and rely less on advertising. I think advertising has probably become less effective. As you say, Google has a lot of dominance in the market. that makes it challenging for others to earn revenue from that, that pile of, advertising revenue. And we all have grown up, most of us have grown up with the internet now and are more accustomed to for buying for services. We pay for Netflix. We don't download torrents. We stream Spotify. We don't download MP3s anymore. We pay for Slack, or we have a LinkedIn Premium for work, or whatever it is. We're becoming much more accustomed to paying for digital services. And so I think if I was to sort of dangerously have a crystal ball here, I feel there's a convergence happening of crypto on one extreme is you have to pay for everything. Web 2 or Web 1 has been you don't pay for anything, but hang on, now you're starting to have to pay for things. I think that we'll actually get to a point where ideally people will have choice. It's the free or freemium model, with a bunch of ads. YouTube do this, quite a lot. It's free or you have ads, or you pay and you don't have ads, or you have less ads. So, and with that user choice should also come choice of it's my data. So, I'd love to see a future where, hey, it's free, but we're going to have your data because we're going to give you ads. Or, hey, you could pay your $5 a month and it's all your data. There's no ads and you've got complete ownership and control. And, ideally, I'd prefer it if everybody had that. But if we're going to compromise here, that sort of scenario can work. And I think that the Web3 crypto model of Web3 is saying, hey, you can actually own some of these protocols and some of these platforms and take an ownership stake. And so in some ways, there's an opportunity to leverage a token to disrupt the Web2 incumbents and say, hey, there's a new business model here. You can actually own a part of the Web3 version of YouTube or the Web3 version of Meta or Twitter or X, which is actually really enticing. It's a way for us to kind of collectively be active in creating this decentralized future of these new types of products and services and take an ownership stake. And I think that again changes the dynamic of what's free and what's paid for. Do I pay $5 in crypto, but that means I actually own a piece of this new product that's being developed? And is that more attractive than paying $5 to X, where it's just to pay Elon Musk and have a profit at the end of the line? So there's going to be some nuance, I think, to this discussion that we have around what are we prepared to pay for and how are we prepared to use and protect our data.
And GDPR is a saint and a sinner. It's so many, especially in healthcare, so many people say it stops the sharing of data, it stops analytics and so on. I think the cookie acceptance in the EU is a classic example of really not solving a major problem and to be an annoyance. So in terms of data regulation, do you think it's a good thing? Because obviously it tends to be on the side of the citizen, or do you think it's a bad thing and can hold things back and the big companies can get away with breaching GDPR in the way that small businesses would struggle with? So where do you stand on data regulations?
Yeah, look, I actually think the regulations or the intent behind the regulations are a net positive. We live, whether people like it or not, we live in a world of regulations. We have road rules. We have all sorts of rules that we have to all abide by, and they're designed to create a better society and a better environment for everyone. And there is challenges that big companies can typically abide by, some of these regulations, and that makes it harder for smaller ones, and then they have to kind of go out of business or get acquired, or they face challenges to meet some of those regulatory requirements. So that's definitely a problem, and I think that regulators could probably do a better job to manage some of the impact there that's brought in. But you look at the big fines that I think Meta have had in relation to their data privacy breaches. We are seeing a growing trend of, I guess, companies in Europe that don't want to deal with personally identifiable information because they deem the risk too high. And to be honest, that's probably a good thing, because the risk is too high and there are too many hacks happening. Every day there's another hack of millions of users data that's been exploited. So it's now creating an economic incentive to do better. And I think that that's really important. And I think the technology that we're working on, and the a lot of this crypto Web3 technology has a really important role to play in the future to help actually provide more technological options that can make compliance easier, and more suitable. I do feel that there's a lack of thinking outside the box, perhaps, with some of these regulations in the way that they're applied by organizations. I mean, healthcare, you mentioned, is an interesting one. If there's concern about not being able to do research and analytics, it's actually not a problem about data. It's actually a problem of consent. Under GDPR, it's really a problem of, hey, it's not, you haven't given me my data and given me the ability to consent to sharing that with you. And so that's actually a structural problem in terms of how businesses sell data and operate today, rather than a problem with GDPR. And so I think that there's a maturity that hasn't come yet, that I think will come over the next sort of 5 to 10 years around, hey, maybe there's a few different ways. Maybe we can actually change a few things, rather than just saying, GDPR regulation's bad. What if we just change some of these models and the way that we do things, and we can be compliant, and we can actually perhaps then even get better data? I mean, I think there's an opportunity. If people have their own data, you can actually, talk to someone and you can get a richer data set than you just went to one data broker. You get more accurate data. So there's, I think, a lack of maybe innovation yet to happen that can marry up meeting regulatory compliance, requirements, and meeting business needs around, and the rights of the individual as well.
Great. And I wonder where you stand on patents and IP protection. On the one hand, small businesses and companies, universities and so on, need to protect their IP, their investments, get licensing deals, and make sure that they can defend themselves in the face of an attack from large companies, which are producing lots of patents, and an SME can really get crunched in the market if it doesn't protect its IP. But some of the areas we're talking about, especially in cryptography, have been held back through patenting, RSA, Diffie-Hellman method, SNOR patents, and so on, where others have actually granted the ownership, say, to the US, citizens of the US. So it's a difficult balance to get right. So for you, or for your advice to other small companies who want to grow, what's your advice on patenting and IP protection?
Yeah, I think probably I see patents as another tool, like technology is a tool. And again, it can be used for good or for bad. And I think fundamentally it's a tool designed to drive innovation and protect the investment, and give a return to people that are innovating. That's the fundamental premise, really. But it can also be used to hold back innovation, as you say, in some circumstances. But ultimately, the decision to hold back innovation and leveraging a patent to do that, or use it for further innovation, is a decision of the holder of the patent. And so again, I think I'd like to distinguish between the individual and their act and what the tool is. So I think if you're a business, and it really depends on the industry that you're in. If you're in biotechnology, or manufacturing, or whatnot, patents can be incredibly valuable to protecting innovation or invention, and allow you to get funding to turn that into a real thing. And that's immensely important part of that innovation story. The space that I'm in with software, there's more of an imperative to move fast, be agile, get adoption, and we innovate and use so many technologies in a piece of software. The dependencies, the number of dependencies of other software, libraries and SDKs and tools that I use and that we use to build software is just immense. In fact, I wouldn't be able to sit here and tell you a fraction of the ones that we use. And this software would not be possible without open source software and people choosing licenses to license their software that make that possible. We're built on this foundation of stand on the shoulders of giants. And so in software, I do get frustrated where there are large companies that have monopolies over patents and leverage them to control a market, or to if I've got 20 patents and you've only got one, well, I've got an advantage over you in terms of deal making and things like that. I don't like that, but that's unfortunately a reality. So if you're a business, think carefully about what you're trying to achieve, and what position you're in the market. Are you building something that's really new and novel? And if other people find out about it, then that's the end of the idea. You can't get funding, you can't commercialize that. Then you're probably going to be looking at a patent. If your imperative is to move really fast, gain users, and create a moat because you've taken you've got a flag and taken ownership of a particular market segment, well, maybe patenting that that idea is not as important as actually just moving really, really fast and innovating. So I think it really depends on what your objective is.
And I think the machine learning industry, if we can call it an industry, has typically been an academic discipline and so on. And they never really had the concept of hooking back data. You've learned with my data, I want it back. You have no rights to it. And especially worrying when we come to deep learning, where it's almost impossible to take the learning out of it because there's no trace back. How do you think cryptography could help to allow this hooking, this privacy? I want my data to be crawled by cancer research, but not by a tobacco company. How do you think cryptography can do that, almost like that physical interlock, to make sure that although it exists on someone's database, they can't actually access it? I mean, that it's a challenging area. I would draw a Venn diagram as machine learning and cryptography, and the bit in the middle is where we really need to get right. And do you see anything evolving in this space?
Yeah, so there is a similar related problem that we're talking to projects about at the moment, where there's a need for a trust registry. And so the use case that we're talking about is more in the context of credentials and saying, hey, if I've got a digital signature, if I've got a piece of data signed, maybe it's a driver's license, is it signed by the government? Is a zero knowledge proof signed by, has it been sourced from a credential that's been signed by maybe a government or a party I trust, or it's a health credential that's been signed by a doctor or by a hospital. And so I think that there's a story here of traceability of data, and digital signatures are obviously a really important part of that. But then you need to have this overlay of this, what is the meaning of that signature? And I think that we currently think of signatures as, hey, this person signed, or this entity or identity signed this piece of data. But a signature could have other meanings too. And so a signature could be to say, hey, this piece of data has this type of permission granted to it as a part of that signature. And to verify the signature, you not only verify who signed it, but you also verify, or discover the intent behind that. And you can start to then think of a pathway, a trust pathway, because that's sort of how this works. Is how do I embed into the AI model the fact that I can guarantee that that model was created with signatures that match this particular intent of this model. So I'm not aware of any cryptography or maths that kind of enable that, but I think that that's the trajectory we'll kind of go towards, because we talk about the patent conversation. That's about protecting innovation and protecting the creator. And we have these AI models that are leveraging information and data from all these creators. We need to still be able to protect those creators in some capacity, and not leave their rights, I guess, from this equation. However, it's easy to say that, and I think very challenging to do that at a technological level and from I guess an enforcement level, at least at this point. I think we're very early in the journey of AI, so I'm sure this will evolve very quickly.
Yeah, I suppose there's also an involvement of trusted agents who will act on your behalf. And certainly for, say, elderly people, there might be someone who is trusted to look after their data. And obviously, when we bring in legal agents, when we're selling a house or so on, we're not going to use a peer-to-peer transaction for that. We are going to use intermediaries. So I think that's one area that we obviously need to evolve and understand, and how we can integrate that into a graphical user interface to understand who our trusted people are. So I appreciate you're probably working on a few things, and there's probably things that you don't want to make public. But what's some of the things that you're working on just now?
Well, yeah, I think I'm fortunate, I guess, that I get to talk to lots of people that are creating new and exciting things. So, for us, our focus is on the technology that we're building around ownership of data. And, a few times in this conversation, we've discussed user interface. And so we've built the Verita wallet, which is really one of the first, I guess we call it almost like a wallet 2.0, because it brings together crypto, owning your data, creating decentralized identities, connecting to other platforms with zero knowledge proofs for Polygon ID, or using things like the Checks network, which is also doing credentials, and decentralized, encrypted private messaging between users and apps. And so we're doing a lot of work to think about that user experience of how we bring all this stuff together in a way that users can understand, but also give them access to this technology, and then allow people to build apps that can make use of that. So I'm fortunate to talk to lots of people that are building apps that are not your usual type of thing. And I think that some of the things that I see that are really interesting are things like decentralized insurance. Being able to take out an insurance policy for a physical item in the real world, or maybe a health insurance policy, and start to think about how do we juggle a public blockchain that has open public transactions and has a bunch of liquidity for a decentralized insurance protocol, but how do I balance that with, I have to have private data and prove to that smart contract that, hey, I have a car, or hey, I don't have a terminal disease for a health insurance policy, or I need to make a claim. So some of the interesting things that we're working on, or working on with our partners, is this conflict, or this sort of balance between what's public and what's private. And we see that with blockchain, everything's public. Zcash is trying to make some things private. Monero, as we mentioned before, are trying to use that same technology to do privacy. We're doing the same things with data. How do we keep people's data private? But is it a zero knowledge proof for this use case that proves that I've got something that's accurate and trusted, so I can interact with a blockchain? Or do I actually have to provide all of that data? Is that the only way that we can do it today, or are there other new cryptographic primitives that somebody's developed that could be used? So there's a lot of really interesting problems that we're fortunate to kind of work on, and we tend to do that with partners that are trying to build products in this sort of space, and trying to innovate.
Great, and hopefully you'll be working with academia somewhere. Not that I'm trying to sell the importance of academia, but obviously they can provide great inputs into the formalization and testing and so on. So my final question is that if you weren't involved in digital identity, where would you be and what would you be doing?
Oh, that's a really good question. Playing golf, does that count?
Playing golf?
Well, to be honest, I think uh, there's probably a professional and a personal. I mean, I think when you're a startup founder, you have a lot of balls that you're juggling, and so I've got a family, so I definitely would be liking to spend more time with them than I probably do. In terms of the professional side, I think that the opportunities, but also the challenges with AI and how quickly that's evolved, is something that's very interesting, and I think there's many people that are definitely curious about that, and I'm definitely one of those. As I've touched on before, my personal background has always been doing things with the newest technology and thinking about how it can be used to improve the world that we live in. And I see that with AI, I see that with the blockchain crypto space, and they're the areas that at least I'd like to think I can probably add the most value, and do things that keep me get me out of bed in the morning and keep me interested in what I'm working on.
Okay. And when we finally get to your tombstone, just in case I'm asked what's going to go on it, what would you like to see on that?
I've never thought about that. It's a very good question. There's probably a few different ways to answer that, but I think if I was to choose something, it'd probably just maybe that I tried. I tried
Yeah.
to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
In whatever way I could. I think we all want to sort of leave the world in a better place if we can. And I think with the technology and the background and skills I have, and the people that I'm fortunate to work with, I think there's a lot of opportunity to try and do that. So definitely want to, I guess, make that effort.
Yeah. As Steve Jobs would say, we're here on this planet to put a dent in it. And we
There you
should
go.
all create our own little dents. And those dents, Apple now are a $3 trillion company because of what Steve Jobs and the people who built Apple created for the ethos of the company. So make your little dent, and that dent could be a really big thing in the
That's
future.
a much more eloquent way of saying a very similar thing. So that's great.